Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here. Welcome to this week's episode of Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to the YFP Planning team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning services that are customized to the pharmacy professional. So whether you want to optimize your investing plan, pay off student loans, or simply build a solid financial plan, YFP Planning will help get your income working for you rather than the other way around. You can learn more by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes from a member of the YFP Facebook group who asks, my in-laws have set up 529 accounts for the kids. Their accounts are well-funded. What should we do with money that the kids get? What kind of accounts should we be opening? I'd like to invest it for them. Thoughts? Thank you in advance for your time. Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think when we read this question, Tim, we interpret it very different. So we're actually going to answer both interpretations, if that makes sense. So I think like the way you were reading this initially was, you know, like, what do we do inside of the 529 in terms of allocation and things like that? And I was reading it as, hey, the 529 is good. What should we do with the kids' money as that comes in apart from the 529? So first, to break down the 529, like your interpretation is, I think the first thing that I would say is, what does well-funded mean? Like, what is the goal for your kids? That's going to drastically be different for a lot of people. So, you know, we have clients that we work with at YFP Planning that they're like, hey, my kid is kind of on their own. Like, I had to figure it out. I want them to as well. And, you know, I'm better for it. But then you have the opposite end of the spectrum where it's like, get as much money into the 529. You know, we want 100% funded, you know, goal for 4 years of college, you know, all the way up to like a doctorate program type of thing. So I would push back on like, what is funded, well funded, and what's the goal? At default, we've kind of talked about a lot of clients, when we ask this question, are like, I don't know, we get the kind of the emoji shrug. What we often recommend, you know, is if you're in that realm and there's some uncertainty with college and future and things like that, is the 1/3 rule. So the 1/3 rule states that, you know, 1/3 of the cost of college and tuition will come from like a 529. So like your past savings. 1/3 would come from your current earnings. So current meaning like when your child is 18 going to college, part of your paycheck is going to the institution to pay for tuition. And then 1/3 would come from things like scholarships, grants, and then last but not least, you know, student loans, unfortunately. So I think having a discussion about what is funded, what's the goal, kind of gets us to like what the target is. You know, it's kind of like a mini retirement, Tim's, right? So we're trying to accumulate assets over hopefully a longer period of time, you know, 18 years, you know, 10, 18 years, depending on when you start, and then distribute that over 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever that is, in a decumulation or withdrawal phase. So it's very similar to like retirement planning in that sense. To look at the allocation, again, it's going to depend on the time horizon. Most people will kind of set it and forget it. You know, they'll put money in monthly, quarterly, yearly. You know, a lot of these 529s, you can set up links. So you can, you know, it's like, hey, instead of like plastic toys, put money in Johnny's 529, which I think is a great idea. And then, you know, you put it in that whatever allocation you set. Just like we talk about with target date funds, as a default, set it and forget it. They are going to be a little bit more expensive. They might not necessarily share your opinion of how much stocks versus bonds. I know my wife and I, we kind of avoid target date funds, but I'm, you know, looking at that a little bit more regularly, at least annually, to make sure that we're still in the right allocation. So I think that interpretation of how you read it, I think is, you know, what's the goal? Define what's funded, and then look at, and again, not all 529s are created equal. So some states have tax benefits, some states don't. So if your state doesn't, you know, you can open up a Nevada 529, you know, it's typically a decent one. Again, not advice, but a decent one if your state doesn't have a benefit. But if it does, even if the 529 is not great, it might make sense to do that just to get the tax benefit. So every 529 is going to differ in terms of expense, in terms of, you know, the types of investments, et cetera. So, you know, you just want to be, you know, cognizant of that. Now, the way that I interpret this question, Tim, was more of along the lines of, if we put a big old green check mark in, we don't have to worry about the kids' education because the in-laws got that on lock, then how do we handle money that comes in for the kids? So like, I remember like my first Holy Communion, it was like in the hundreds of dollars that like I got for that. And I was like, this is the most money like I'll ever see in my life. And I think it was just really squirreled away in like a savings account that I never saw. So, and I got that money later for, I don't know, maybe like towards like a car. So I think like the way that I was like writing some notes for this answer is, as a parent, you want to define what you think the money is for and either direct the child that way accordingly or incentivize your child to do that. So if you're thinking like, hey, this birthday money, this communion money, this graduation money, I want them to learn more about, maybe one of the options is like, I want them to learn more about money, or I want to buy things that I want them to be able to buy things that I don't want to buy. So that might be, I was talking to, I think this was my nephew. He's like, I bought this Lego set that for $50 and he saved forever, and it was like an exercise that my brother was trying to do with him to like save and, kind of delayed gratification and all that kind of stuff. So it could be that, or it could be something long-term where you want this money to kind of be squirreled away for a car purchase in high school, or maybe an option for a gap year to go travel or something like that. So I think it's thinking about that. One of the books that I read, I actually read it a couple of times. It's, and we could put it in the show notes, The Opposite of Spoiled: Raising Kids Who Are Grounded, Generous, and Smart About Money. And it kind of goes through that idea of, it talks about allowances, it talks about money earned, gifts, things like that. But it's kind of like the 3-bucket approach of like, saving a certain amount, giving a certain amount, and then, spending a certain amount. And this might be a good way for you to demonstrate to your kids, like, hey, if you save this, I'll match, if you save $1, I'll match $1. If you give, if you give $1, I'll match $1. But I think it is also important, I think about my niece, Sophia, who tells me her bank account balance every time I see her, because she's a great saver. But part of me thinks in my head, like, you should, like, you're a little kid, like, you should spend it. She's always like, oh, like, let me, we'll go to Fox in the Snow, which is a coffee shop around here. And she's like, I want a treat. Like, I want to do this. And I'm like, you should be spending this on things that are going to like rot your brain and your teeth, not like adult stuff. But I think that those are things like, and in the book, it kind of talks about like, I don't know about you, Tim, growing up, but like, I wasn't given an allowance. We had to basically work, like we had chores and we would get paid for that. I think that's how it worked. And the book says is like, everyone should pull their weight in the house, just how it is, but you should still give an allowance, and mainly to kind of teach your kids about saving, giving, spending, like teach them a concept that's not attached to like behavior or things like that. And I try to go down this path with my 7-year-old, and I'm like, I think we're going to wait until you're 8, just from a maturity standpoint, but like, and I can report back on that. So longer answer, I think depending on what you do, and kind of the approach that you take with your kids is going to define the vehicle. I think there could be something really tangible to like taking the dollars to like your local bank and having your little one deposit that, so that could be a savings account. If it's something that's more long-term, like, hey, we're going to put X amount of percent towards this long-term fund, it could be a taxable account that you actually invest, because that's a better place to put long-term account. If it's your kids a little bit older and they're making income, maybe you incentivize them to start, a Roth IRA. I think I had a Roth IRA when I was 16. Didn't even know what it meant, but like start getting them to think more about kind of longer term stuff. So I think depending on what you do, like what we have in our house, which we haven't really started, is we have a jar for save, give, and spend. So it's a tangible thing that we, when we start doing the allowance thing and testing it out, we're going to put X amount into each jar. And I think the idea would be to incentivize what we want, in terms of saving, in terms of giving, and then probably take that money to the bank and actually, have them deposit it and understand like that tangible nature. So there's a lot of ways to kind of go about it. Some people, like, I think if I were to talk to my mom, she'd be like, oh no, like you need to work for your money, that type of thing. Like there's no free ride. So there's like counterpoints to all that. So, and again, just like parenting, you're a young parent out there, everyone has their own way to do it. It's just a matter of finding what works for you, what works for your kiddo. But I think probably some more sensible thought and building that foundation, young in kids is probably a good thing. Like when I was growing up, we just didn't talk about money because it was almost rude to. But I think if we pull back some of that taboo, I think you're just gonna, so many of our clients will say something like, oh man, like I wish they taught this growing up, or I wish we were taught this in school, or, and I think we can overcome that just by talking about it more. So it's a great question.
Yeah, great stuff, Tim. I love the direction of taking a step back and what's the purpose? What's the goal? What do we want to, get through this experience? And as you were talking, I was having flashbacks, and I think my parents did an awesome job of, from Jump Street, whether it was a $2 allowance or eventually, bigger numbers, like there was a save, the spend, to give buckets. And I can remember physically walking into the bank, Alden State Bank, where I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and opening a checking account, getting the debit card, starting to understand. I think what's more challenging about that now, I remember opening up an Ally savings account for my oldest son, Sam. Like it took a lot more work to explain it because it was, there was no cash involved from Jump Street, right? It might've been a check or something from his birthday. It was an electronic deposit of a check. And then all of a sudden, like what he thought was of the money in the check, like went away, and now it's in this account, like somewhere online, right?
Yeah.
It's just harder.
Yeah, maybe what you need to do is just get him like a wad of like $1 bills and have him walk in with like the gangster roll, and make it more tangible. Yeah, it's hard for that, but I think like there's just probably a lot more opportunity, again, because like it's just something that like you pick up later in life. You're like, oh, okay, that's how it works. And that's why like part of the points of the book of like giving a kid allowance that's like not necessarily tied to behavior is to have a consistent, almost like decision about how to handle money that isn't interrupted by like you not eating your dinner or picking up your room or things like that. So you're consistently saying, okay, if you're a member of society and you're a working, tax paying, you're going to have money that's going to flow in, and you're going to be given the same type of buckets, yourself, in terms of like, what should I put into my 401k save or my Ally account, or, am I given? And then what is left over to spend? Whereas most people, they'll get the money and then they'll pay whatever bills are necessary, and then they spend, and whatever's left over is saved. And that's just, it's a fundamental thing that I think the younger that you can impart some of those lessons, even if it's like a heavy lift at first, I think it's probably well worth it. And there's definitely, and a lot of this is kind of ingrained in you based on like what your parents teach you. And if you grow up in a household that has lots of credit card debt and you're very spendthrifty, that's, a lot of times is going to transfer over to the kid. And, so it can be like a generational thing. And, to me, if you're more they'll have the mindset of give in and things like that, that'll transfer. So I think it's really determining like what you want for your kiddo, and then building from there. But it's tough. Like it's always like, am I screwing my kid up type of thing, which is just parenting in general. So
great stuff. We'll link in the show notes of the book you mentioned. A couple of the resources. Episode 202, I had a chance to interview Dylan Redling, Allison Tom, authors of Investing for Kids, How to Save, Invest, and Grow Money. Great book. Lots of great activities in that book that are referenced as well. We'll link to that. And then episode 211, you and I, Tim, talked about the ins and outs of the 529. And then we also have a blog post on things to consider before starting a 529 account. So maybe for those that are on the early end of that. So appreciate the question from the member in the YFP Facebook group. For those that have a question that you'd like to have featured on an upcoming episode, 2 ways you can submit that. Shoot us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can record your question by going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask-YFP. As we wrap up this week's Ask a YFP CFP episode, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for informational, educational purposes only, and is not intended to provide, should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and in corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. More information, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.